Hilariously, I almost wore that shirt this morning, so I'm really glad I changed my mind. You never want to be the guy who shows up to speak wearing the exact outfit you were wearing in your headshot. It really shows a lack of range. So today I'm going to be speaking about data versus insights. That versus is probably a bit of a stretch. They're two things that work very well together. They're also two things that get confused very regularly, so I tend to make a point of trying to pit them at odds, if only to kind of kick off the conversation. In terms of what that really means, this is going to be a conversation about how to make more meaningful stuff. Now, I use the word meaningful with a little m rather than a big M. I'm not talking about the meaning of life. I'm not talking about finding religion. I'm not talking about finding a new belief system that's going to change everything about what you're doing. I'm talking about making stuff that means something to someone, something beyond the really, really basic functional benefits of the thing you're creating. And I use the word stuff because stuff is just broad enough to cover pretty much everything from content to building experiences to building physical in-store experiences. It covers the whole gamut of things you could potentially create. So to get there, we're going to talk about funnels and journeys, the differences and the ways they work together. We're going to talk about, as I mentioned, data versus insights and the confusions that fall into that realm. And we're also going to talk about the process of getting from what to getting to why. I find very often so I work in advertising, but I find very often anyone working in a creative industry has a lot of trouble remembering to get to why rather than focusing specifically on what they want to do or what their client wants to do or what the user needs to do to move to the next experience. But before I go any further, I should probably explain why you have to listen to me talk about this. So my name's Jon Crowley. I work in advertising in a global firm called Sidley. I work out of the Toronto office. And I've worked on a broad range of strategy projects, everything ranging from digital strategy back in the dark ages when digital strategy was creating a Facebook page for your brand, to working on much larger projects focused on the entire holistic customer and brand experience and how people can really walk through that. So let's jump in. Funnels and journeys. So this is my bad old man joke slide. I apologize for making dad jokes all the time. It's a personal character flaw. We're not actually going to talk about literal funnels. We're going to talk about sales funnels. Now, sales funnels have kind of infected thinking in our combined industries and universe. So this is a very basic graphic of a simplified sales funnel. You get people aware of whatever it is you're selling them. You get them interested in whatever it is you're selling them. You push them to make a decision about the thing you want them to buy, and then hopefully you drive some action at the end. This is hugely popular in businesses across the world because it explains essentially the path money needs to flow through to come out of customers and into your pockets. You drive people down this funnel, at the bottom there's profit, and everyone is happy. The problem is this funnel thinking is really infectious, and it becomes the only way people start thinking about their relationships with human beings. This is Google's customer journey tool is the way they kind of frame it. It's the online customer journey for advertising. What's interesting is it's not really focused on a journey a customer takes. It's really just a bunch of interactions with a brand that essentially lead to money. You've got your high-level awareness interactions here when you're shooting information through social media in hopes that people run into it. You can gauge interest by whether or not people engage with something by clicking on a display link or typing in organic or general paid search terms. You try to push a decision by offering emails through brand or when people have already narrowed in on a specific brand using brand paid search. And then you're hoping to drive action with direct marketing to push people in store. This is still really heavily focused on migrating people down those 4 stages, which are a couple hundred years old at this point, and are actually based on the tactics developed by door-to-door salesmen. Sorry, I'm still a little bit jet-lagged. I might be bad at speaking English for a little while. The important thing I want to get across is that a funnel and a journey are two completely different things and different experiences, and as a combined set of industries, we've fallen into a trap of conflating the two ideas, pretending that if we attach enough things to our sales funnel, it'll become a user journey and somehow it'll be a meaningful experience for all of the people who are engaging with it. Now, a funnel's not a journey when you glue stuff to it. I don't care if you're gluing specific media, no matter how many different YouTube videos you make about the different stages you want to migrate people through, it's not necessarily a journey. People walking through your website, if you're migrating them towards that point where they pay you, still not really a journey, and it works with physical stores too. I don't really care how many arrows IKEA puts on the floor to show you the optimal path to wander through the store. It's still fundamentally transactional in nature rather than an experience based on a human being enjoying something or something developing some specific meaning to them. So this awareness, interest, decision, action funnel, I was going to make a joke about Glengarry Glen Ross, but now I'm not sure how much that'll translate, given I'm a time zone away from where I normally make that joke. But this is a really standard thing, but the problem with it is it believes in a certain type of human. This is probably a little hard to read if you're sitting at the back, but it's essentially a day in a human life condensed down to nothing but media interactions. Imagine if you wake up, check your phone, browse Facebook, use Google, read a website, check your weather app, read the newspaper, go to the transit shelter, see an ad in the transit shelter, get on the bus, put your headphones on the bus, listen to Spotify, hear 2 ads because you haven't yet paid for a premium account, get off the bus, read a magazine, open up your computer at work, browse a few more websites, eat lunch, go home, watch TV. That would be a very soul-crushing, depressing life, but it's the view of your life that an advertiser has of you when they think of you solely as an active consumer in their sales funnel. It's condensing people down to their interactions with things that we control, interactions with media, interactions with sites, interactions with experiences that we make in an attempt to gain something from them. And it's inherently kind of dehumanizing in a deer-in-the-headlights kind of way. Things just kind of wash over you when you look at human beings this way and don't pay attention to their actual behaviors, the actual ways you can interact with them. So a funnel is fundamentally a very business-driven view of the world. It's the idea that everything can be categorized into different roles, everything can be categorized into different benefits for who you are and what you do as an organization, and everyone can kind of be reduced to their most drone-like state in terms of accomplishing something for you specifically. This is a family circus cartoon. I'm unsure if the family circus is popular in Hungary, but I'm going to give it a shot anyways. The long and short of this cartoon is it's a tendency in this series to show images of this little boy, Billy, exploring the world. There are dozens and dozens of these specific examples of this funny little path where he runs around the universe. Now, what's interesting is after he helps fix a car's engine, hitches a ride, plays with his dog, he goes and tells his mother there's nothing to do. And I love that specific moment because it's true of most people's interactions with brands and companies. They have this tiny element of your entire day, and they'll believe anything you tell them in that tiny element of your entire day because they have none of the context of the 400 other things you were doing before that interaction. An actual customer journey, a journey that a person you would care about goes on, has so many elements that have nothing to do with your own platforms, your own experiences, your own creations, and that's the information that's going to help you create something more meaningful for them than asking 2 or 3 questions as they wander onto your specific platform, into your specific location, or up to you as a specific person. So journeys are inherently customer-driven. It's the experiences a person has independent of your brand, what you're asking them to do, independent of the individual things you create. And it's really important to consider journeys as customer-driven, because I know sitting in a room of UX professionals, a lot of you spend a lot of time thinking about the experience, thinking about the path, thinking about the journey that someone who you are envisioning as your user is going to go on. That is inherently flawed if you don't consider all the influences outside of your controlled world and your controlled space. So here's a fairly straightforward and standard example of a journey. The things that are important here is you look at the thoughts and feelings of the human being, you look at the emotional experience, and you look at the different phases that someone goes through. You kind of section out the different moments they take, the different feelings they have, the different actions that are plausible here. The reason it's important to kind of look at this broader universe is it creates all the little areas of influence that can really change the path that people follow. It can really change the way people will interpret the information you give them. If you find out, for example, this specific journey is about purchasing a broadband provider. If you find out that the most influential person in the world to your broadband purchase is going to be your internal family tech guru, who might be a 14-year-old boy, or might be your cousin who you speak to 4 times a year, it completely changes the experience, rather than looking only at your own data and finding that people who happen to look at a specific page on your site are slightly more likely to convert than anyone else. Here are some more examples showing you can make a journey look as complicated as humanly possible in an attempt to make it seem very impressive. You can create really interesting patterns, you can create really interesting setups to make it seem as though this is a thing that no human being could comprehend, and therefore people need to pay you lots of money to provide this service. I understand the value of that, but I'm not necessarily going to say that that's the path you need to follow. So, to recap the journey section, Journey's focused on a much broader context than a funnel. It's about building that greater understanding and building that greater belief in who your humans that you're speaking to are. You need to focus heavily on the actions outside of your brand, outside of your product, outside of your universe. You're going to notice I use the word brand a lot. That's a side effect of me working as a strategic planner in an ad agency. My entire world is dancing around singing the praises of brand. But brand is mostly the point where people's beliefs about a company or a product interact with the product itself, and I think that's still really valid for this audience, for this subject. Finally, it's inherently customer-focused. You need to kind of look at the point of view of the human beings you're hoping to speak to and understand them in a broader world and broader context than simply how they interact with the things you make or the things you sell. So now we're going to get to the fun part, data versus insights. This is actually my personal pet peeve. In my role, in the work I do a significant amount of research, and sometime around, I would estimate around 2007, 2008, but I could be wrong, we stopped using the word data for data and started pretending that data was insights if you looked at a small enough piece of it. My classic example of this was when more and more different platforms started launching semi-automated analytics services, and they'd pop up an insight that they'd surfaced from your data, and the insight would be a singular statistic. It would be people who clicked this are more likely to have clicked this if they're a 47-year-old female. Or people who are 17 or under are more likely to spend more time on this specific page. That's great and helpful information. I'm unsure what is insightful about that. I'm unsure how you understand these people that this data is representing in any deeper way, in any more meaningful way. So we all know data is everywhere. This is my obvious statement slide. You need one in every presentation. It's one of the rules. Data is everywhere. We all see it all the time. And it's more and more of a conversation. So this is a Google search volume chart, just kind of showing the number of people getting very excited about searching for big data. It's kind of a large topic. There's a conference over there where you can learn more about it, but really, no one's going to laugh at that one. It's interesting watching entire industries get obsessed with this idea of more data and crunching more data, but not necessarily actively considering what they're going to do with it and how it should inform the actions they're going to take. So occasionally, I work with a single company that works in the Canadian market that focuses on learning and gathering more user data. They're called Environics, and this is their list of partners. This is the number of people they go to track information about every single consumer in Canada that they can find. Whether it's asking them specific questions to develop a better understanding of what things they buy, their credit rating, what magazines they're likely to read, TV shows they're likely to watch, a radio station they're likely to listen to, what areas they're wandering through, going down by postal code data to understand how much money people make, what the predominant religion in a specific area is. This is the kind of information that's available all over the world. And very often, we focus only on the tiny slice of information that we made at home. The information that we get because we did a specific consumer survey, because we talked to, if we're lucky, 100 people over a course of focus groups over a matter of weeks, or that we gathered from, again, our own platforms, our sites, our apps, looking at what people specifically do. This is a small slice of the universe of what humans actually are, but it's much larger than what most of us ever consider when we're actually developing an understanding of who our customers are and how they behave. What's interesting, though, is you can see the way data gets used based on talking to the people who very often make those decisions, those fun senior-level marketers that eMarketer loves to interview on a regular basis. 54% of senior-level marketers said that the main benefit of making decisions based on data is making decisions better, making decisions more accurately. What's interesting is they don't really dig into the question of what are we considering data? What value are we getting from this specific information? I would bet good money most of the people making these more accurate decisions are actually making decisions based on a pretty myopic set of data that happens to be privileged because it was made in their own house, because it comes from a team that has access to their specific platform. Making decisions based only on one small subsegment of who the human being you're interacting with is a great recipe to optimize yourself to irrelevance. Similarly, that similar group of senior-level marketers, when you ask them about the most effective uses of marketing data, they said the most depressing thing they could possibly say, which is campaign targeting. Literally, sending more stuff to more specific people is the main benefit that senior-level marketers saw from effective uses of data in the universe of marketing. And I wonder how many times we collectively focus on getting more stuff to an ever narrower group of people rather than making it mean anything to those specific group of people. The key point I want to get at here is data is invaluable, data is very important, but data is only what? It only tells you a thing that is. It doesn't necessarily tell you anything about why. Data can tell you actions people take and how frequently they take them. It can tell you what people are paying attention to, which is great and valuable. And it can tell you facts about your user base, facts about the people you're interacting with, facts about the universe. The thing is that facts can be misleading without context. There are lots of things that you'll interact with in the world that make almost no sense. I decided that to illustrate this, I should pick the thing that I remember making the least sense in my life, which is dating. So this is a chart from a book called Dataclysm. I wouldn't be shocked if a bunch of people have read it here, but it's a really interesting read. This is based on data from OkCupid, and this is a graph that essentially argues that the enjoyment that a woman has on a date has no direct relationship to how attractive her and her date are perceived as by the collective group of people on OkCupid. Essentially, this is a slide using two data sets, comparing them, making a really compelling argument that attractiveness isn't important in dating, which is a lovely thing to say and a beautiful thing to believe and really, really hard to prove out based on my personal life experience as a person dating. Thankfully, I got married last year, so hopefully I never need to date again. But this was an interesting read to consider when you looked at something available a couple of pages later. This is actually that same happiness in person after the first date plotted against the likeliness to respond to someone based off of the same attractiveness gaps. So if a woman is much more attractive than a man, she's much less likely to respond to him. If a man is much more attractive than a woman, she's much more likely to respond to his post. Again, these are objective, air quotes, measures of attractiveness based on the broader OkCupid community, which has this poisonous element of rating people's attractiveness. But I thought it was super interesting that suddenly you layer one more set of data on, you add a little bit more context, and it's not that attractiveness is unimportant, it's that attractiveness is important at first. This is what I mean when I say what isn't why. Having data about things that happen, having data about specific experiences, doesn't actually tell you a damn thing about why it happened, which is why the value of getting out and talking to humans, as I'm sure all of you know, is so incredibly high. Talking to a human being, you'll understand that they didn't bounce off a site because the site was particularly terribly designed. They bounced off the site because the cat just knocked over a vase and they needed to go clean it up before their toddler walked on the broken glass. That's a really specific example. You'd think it was based on something, but oddly it isn't. The other thing to keep mind of is that so what also isn't why. And this is the favorite question of everyone in every executive presentation I've ever given. You present to them some new information, you let them know something huge has happened, and they're like, great, give me the so what. What am I going to do to action this new information you've given me? I demand a plan immediately. Here's what that would look like for these two fun charts. So the first one, your so what would be ignore attractiveness, it's irrelevant. If you ran OkCupid, you'd take the pictures off the site because attractiveness is just a distraction from actually enjoying dates. That probably would have been a terrible decision, but if you have one data point, it really makes sense. Similarly here, the takeaway would be that your goal should be to manage the initial bias towards attractiveness. Try to institute some kind of way to keep people from making decisions based on this idea that attractiveness is really what's going to make you happy. This still seems dangerous, even though it's a little bit closer to the truth. And the thing I find super interesting here is that when you dig into why, you end up finding interesting cultural, sociological, psychological answers to the questions posed by data. Very often, data is excellent for creating questions that we need to then dig outside of our own little universe, our own little platforms, our own little sources of information to find real truth and real meaning in. So finding insight is the process of exploring why things are happening rather than just what they actually are. The way I approach finding insights, and this is actually fairly standard, is looking for human truths, looking for things that you can find that are demonstrably accurate about people's behavior, things that kind of help you understand why people are going through the motions they're going through. In this case, the human truth, which I think we're all somewhat familiar with, is that people respond to beauty norms on a somewhat instinctual level. It's the same reason that taller people who are more conventionally attractive are more likely to be politicians or business leaders. It's the same reason that studies I've seen, at least in North America, indicate people who are more conventionally attractive get better service at restaurants, get better service when they're getting their car repaired. It's not fair, it just happens to be true. The next thing you need is attention. You need some kind of point of friction between the stories we tell ourselves and the things that we can observe. Humans are really great at developing narratives that we can believe in, that justify our actions. I mean, the simplest version of this is, if someone sticks you with a pin, you will tell yourself, I felt a sharp poke and then I jumped. That's not actually how it happened. You jumped before you perceived the poke. But the story you're going to tell yourself is the exact opposite. Similarly to that, a story we tell ourselves all the time is that, what we want is this thing and it's going to make us happy. Lots of people think they want to be with someone who's very attractive, but we just found out it doesn't impact enjoyment when you're on a date. So suddenly the story you're telling yourself and the data we're seeing are interacting in a directly conflicting way, which creates an interesting tension that's worth exploring. And then generally, I look for some relevance to either the brand I'm working with, the product I'm working on, or the experience I'm looking to create. In this case, seeing someone's little intangibles is difficult to do in online dating. And by this I mean, anyone I know who's in a long-term relationship has a list of things they love about their partner that are like quirky and not very obvious and almost impossible to translate via text message. Like the way someone laughs, or the way someone's nose crinkles when they smile, or the way someone is pathologically afraid of olives and will want to move them off the table whenever they're eating. These are the intangibles that you don't actually see until you get to meet someone. And that can often be the element that might be the thing adding that enjoyment to the moment, but isn't something that a brand like OkCupid could directly relate to. When you mash these three pieces together, and this is how you can tell I didn't use Prezi's fantastic presentation software, because that was actually a really low-grade kind of slide-together Venn diagram moment, you can pick together specific insights from the overarching piece. And the thing that I realized when I went away from this book and this example and started interviewing people I know, which is the occupational hazard of being a strategic planner, is you alienate everyone in your life, because you'll sit and have coffee with them and ask them how their family is doing, and then you'll want to have a 45-minute conversation about how they chose their cell phone plan, or how they chose their bank card, or the last conversation they had with their home finances. Finding that human context is so important. But the thing that kind of jumped out is that the purpose of a date for many people isn't just to enjoy a date. Match.com wouldn't be running commercials worldwide explaining that you too can find your partner if it wasn't that people are trying to find a partner they can see themselves with. They're trying to find someone they can relate to, someone they can imagine having a future with. And as silly as it sounds, we all have our internalized fiction about what's going to make us happy. So finding a partner you can see yourself with often requires finding that person attractive to a certain degree. You can't picture 20 years in the future growing old with someone who you don't really like looking at. It doesn't play out super well for the majority of people, especially in their early day dating life. So that was the funnest example I could come up with to talk about the separation between data and insights. Everything else was really boring consumer products, which is hard to develop a strong emotional connection to, but we're going to get to how to do that later. So just as a recap, data can be very misleading. I have to click this twice because I put a little space between the things. Insight is about understanding why, and about that pursuit of understanding why stuff is happening rather than just what is happening. And it's best thought of as a lens to guide thinking. Now, insight doesn't actually solve any problems. That's the hardest part about convincing people to pay you to generate insights. Insight doesn't get directly to action, but it helps you actually understand the problems you're trying to solve. Very often, we skip over diagnosis and go straight to solution. Diagnosis is really important, because you end up optimizing for the wrong things, solving the wrong problem, and misidentifying what you really have an opportunity to accomplish. Now we're going to talk about the funnest part for me, which is getting from what to why. This is, in many ways, the simplest complicated way to describe what I do. By simplest complicated way, I mean it's a really easy sentence to say, but then it requires a 20-minute conversation explaining what I actually mean, both by what, why, and getting from what to why. So, as a reminder, journeys are heavily customer-driven. Here's an example of one. I thought it was pretty. Journeys are about the motivations of a person. They're about the emotions that a person is feeling and their response to different activities. And they're also about the things that influence them. They're about the people, the sources of information, and the experiences that kind of shift people's responses, shift people's answers, shift people's approaches to things. This is an incredibly simplified customer journey. I like making things as simple as possible because it forces me to actually think about what I want them to mean rather than how pretty I can get them to look. But in short, this shows a journey of someone becoming aware that a product, brand, or experience exists, understanding what it is at the comprehension phase, considering it, which can be researching it or just evaluating it on site, but understanding what they actually want to accomplish. Acquiring the thing, which is often the only stage we think of. How does someone go buy this? How can we migrate someone from point A to point B? Then they actually experience the thing, which is generally either a good thing or bad thing, depending on how mediocre our product is. And then there's an end result. They can either adopt or reject the specific thing we've offered them and brought into their life. Now, you'll notice these are just kind of bubbles floating in space. That's because one of my firmest beliefs is that the future of experience is inherently nonlinear. The assumption that people will start at a given point and go to a given point and continue taking every step you want them to take is kind of the height of vanity. We live in a world of infinite options deliverable in your pocket at all times, and the idea that someone's going to go from one page on your site to another page on your site, or from a video you put on social media to a checkout experience that you've built, seems like the height of, I can't remember the word, but you know, the height of hubris. There we go. I knew I'd get there eventually. That said, it's almost impossible to tell a story without linearity, so you throw an arrow in the back, but you try to create separate moments that can exist and provide value on their own. Now, this is an attempt to kind of explain how I would guide people to develop one of those moments. At every stage of a journey, every one of those steps that we talked about, there are individual things that you need to figure out. First off is your trigger, then your mindset, behavior, needs, channels, brand role. I'm going to explain all of these in more detail, but first I want to remind everyone that what isn't why. And that gap between what and why is why exercises like this to understand a person's experience and what their influences are so important. Because what won't get you to why, but a whole bunch of what's, you can suddenly start building a theory. With a sufficient amount of what's, why can make itself apparent. So back to my fun stage diagram. When I build out my spidery little explanation of what's happening, you'll see that the trigger is really about how people enter this specific stage. What's driving them to do this? How are they getting into this experience? This can be outside motivators, it can be intrinsic motivators. It sometimes, but way more rarely than I'd like to admit, can be advertising, showing someone the right thing at the right time in the right place. The mindset of a person isn't just like their emotional health, it's also how open they are to new experiences, it's what's influencing them, what they're intrigued by, what they're interested in the moment, and also the feelings they have. Behavior is behavior. That should be fairly straightforward. What are people actually doing? How are they engaging with people? Needs are important because that's where you understand what value looks like to these people. The needs you have in every different situation are going to change, and as you move across a journey, as you move across an experience in a specific space, your needs could shift 5, 6, 7 times from A to B. If someone offers you what you needed at the beginning of an experience, at the end of experience, it's the most irritating thing in the world. Imagine going to a car dealership to buy a car you've chosen 400 times, and then having someone walk you through what an SUV is. It would be infuriating. You've already gotten there, but they're trying to bring you back to the beginning. Channels are important only because they're the different touch points we have to reach people. I operate on a broad definition of channels. A channel isn't necessarily a place where you can place a message or buy media. Someone's mom can be a hugely influential channel. Someone's conversation at the coffee shop can really shift their perception of something. And then finally, brand role. So why should we care about us is the great overarching question that all of us should be asking every single day. Everyone has too much on their minds. Everyone has too much going on. Everyone has access to limitless information existing in ever-refreshing slot machines that are designed to get us that little bit addicted to that next refresh. But why should they care about us is an important question because it puts the onus back on us to mean something. Not that we tricked them into caring about us, but that we're providing something of enough value that people are willing to care about who we are and what we're offering them. And that's the focus of the brand role stage. It's us asking that question, is there something for us to do at this point in a person's experience? This, to me, is the most important question you can ask whenever you're looking at the experience a user has, looking at the experience a human or a customer has, trying to find the best way to engage with them. Because normally, our default answer is yes, and we just make stuff. Like, the history of social media is brands seeing a new space where there are people having fun, and then immediately jumping in to ruin it, not because there's a role they can play there or value they can provide, but just because it's an empty space where you can put stuff. If we asked ourselves the question, is there something meaningful for us to do here, rather than is there something for us to gain by being here, it's suddenly a really different approach. And I'm not so high-minded, I'm not so idealistic as to believe we're never going to do things just because they work, but it would be nice to ask the question once in a while, is there real value we can provide here? Is there something for us to do in this space? So the question kind of shifts from why should they care about us, a very us-centric question, to what do they care about now. Understanding where someone is in their experience, what matters to them, and how we can play a natural role feeding into it, providing value rather than just trying to extract money. This is the exact same diagram we just talked about, but I wanted to walk through a specific example to kind of give a little bit of visibility to what thinking kind of goes into filling out one of these. So this is a home improvement journey looking specifically at the consideration stage. So a home improvement journey example would be, I want to replace the banister on my main staircase because it's been falling apart for years. The things that are interesting about home improvement is the trigger is almost always seasonal or financial. People do home improvement things because the weather is good or because they finally have the money to pay for it, because home improvement stuff is expensive. That gives you a whole slate of different ways to approach those problems, knowing those two simple contextual facts. From a mindset perspective, interviewing people, we found that lots of them just wanted to understand how they were going to make this happen. Fixing something yourself in your home is very daunting if you're not a naturally handy person. Hiring someone else to fix something in your home is very daunting if you're not a naturally trusting person. So how to solve that problem was very engaging. In terms of behavior, people obviously did a bunch of research. They discussed with their stakeholders, which is a fancy way to say friends and family. It was easier to fit stakeholders in that tiny box. And they also consult with experts. You know, they'll bring people in to review things they're doing. They'll bring people in to take a look at the space, give them an estimate, et cetera. Their needs are inspiration, detailed information, and executional guidance. Generally in that order, it's what the heck do I want to do? What the heck does that really mean? And then how the heck am I going to get it done? In terms of channels, what we found was really valuable here was digital content, in-store experiences, CRM, SEM, and events were huge. People doing home improvement things love to feel their options. They love to like walk up to a plank of cedar and feel it and imagine what it would look like in their home. All of this takes us to the brand role that we discovered, which was connecting the customer to expertise that made planning simpler. It wasn't sell people a bunch of crap, because they're going to buy the crap anyways if they go through the experience. If we've motivated them to finish the concept of doing this home improvement project, they're going to end up spending the money. But focusing on providing value made it more likely they would spend the money with us. And Us is one of the large North American home improvement brands. It's one of the orange ones. I'm not going to tell you the name because I don't currently work with them anymore. So this is, again, really simplified journey approach, moving from awareness to an end result of either adoption or rejection. And that was kind of how you run through it. Now, every time I do this, people ask me, like, what does this really mean? Can you show me an example of this in action? And generally, it gets deep enough into the weeds that I can't convince any of my clients to let me show the example of how we thought about their specific challenge, their specific tactic. So I picked two brands that I love dearly. I'm a bit of a sneakerhead. That's actually what I'm going to do after this conference is over, find every good shoe store in town and spend time and money there. But I thought I'd talk about an example where Nike and Adidas both decided to solve the same problem at around the same time. One of them used a very funnel-driven approach, and one of them used a much more journey-driven approach that led to some interesting storytelling. So the challenge here, we'll start with Adidas. The challenge here was no one's ever run a marathon in under 2 hours. It's a very exciting point in a sport that's kind of hard to watch consistently. Does anyone here watch marathons regularly? Turn on the TV? No? I assumed not. I love the marathon as a sport specifically because it's one of those things that's superhuman but also vaguely achievable. Like, I couldn't run a marathon, but I go to work with people who run marathons. They're not competitive, but they run marathons. Like, it's a superhuman thing that Steve in accounting could do, which always seems super exciting because it could be both aspiring and attainable at the same time. So what Adidas did when it decided it was going to help someone run a sub-2-hour marathon was they launched a new shoe called the Sub 2. It's not the most inventive name I've ever heard, but you got to give them points for trying. They launched it with their newest technology. They did a very standard media launch, and then they followed it up by having one of their sponsored athletes run a race in the new shoe, do a media launch about that. Wilson Kipsang ran a very impressive 2 hours, 3 minutes, and 58 seconds. He didn't quite break the limit. No one has yet, but this was their experience. They essentially said, what we're going to do is build awareness about this. We're going to introduce this product and make sure people know what's going on with it. And then we're going to demonstrate the product to drive interest and maybe push people to a decision. We're going to take a top flight athlete and get him to use this product, prove that it's valid, prove that it's meaningful, and then hopefully people will go buy the thing. This is a very standard funnel-driven approach to marketing, where it's just how quickly can we push people to the point of decision and the point of purchase. Nike, being Nike, did things a little bit differently. And I'm going to open by kind of showing you how they framed up this fairly functional challenge. Huh. Interesting. OK. So I thought there was a video there. Anyways, Nike introduces the Breaking 2 project. Already a more interesting name. They focused on the fact that they were going to do a large, connected experience, bringing in 3 people they'd chosen for specific scientific criteria, and using all of their innovation, technology, and products in an attempt to help them break this 2-hour marathon barrier. Oh, this is where I put the video. Always check your slides before you get on stage.
Breaking the 2-hour marathon barrier is impossible. Everyone knows that. History knows it. Science knows it. Anyone in their right mind knows it. It's crazy. Nobody can run that fast for that long. So, we're doing it.
Now, I'm pretty sure we're all familiar with the fact that Nike loves making things as epic seeming as possible. But I mean, we are literally talking about running at around the same pace for 2 hours, and they just made it feel like gladiators going off to war. Like, I love that. So, taking this approach allowed them to dig a little bit deeper and tell a much more involved story. So they talked about the team of people they assembled to make this happen. They talked about bringing in experts in nutrition, experts in biomechanics, experts in every material they could come up with to try to create the proper equipment and training regimen and diet for these people to break this boundary. They picked a specific location and got to tell a story about that, why that location mattered, why it was perfect. Essentially, the altitude was right, the temperatures were mostly optimal, and I think humidity was solid. Then they layered in some product. You'll notice we talked for a good minute and a half about Nike before we talked about product. That makes me deeply happy. They identified a problem to solve, got people to believe in it, and then said, oh, by the way, we made some new shoes. You might want to check them out as part of this massive undertaking. They started talking about the overall race strategy, creating a new audience not only for people who happen to think sneakers are interesting or who are really interested in this, but suddenly if you're a marathon runner, reading about the race strategy that Nike's team of experts develops for someone to potentially break this audacious goal gives you value beyond specifically the outcome of this project. It gives you value that you weren't necessarily looking for, and it creates something that lives on longer than your specific marketing experience. Then they take it a step further and start talking about the existential reasons about why this matters beyond just the distance that a person is running. Really going to that higher order meaning and speaking to the value of physical activity, the value of setting goals, value of reaching for them. A lot of this is really high-minded and not directly actionable, but it does a lot to add meaning to something that could otherwise be a fairly underwhelming sneaker commercial. And then finally, Nike celebrated its results. Still no one has run a marathon in 2 hours, even though lots of experts would have told you this doesn't necessarily count because it was really isolated conditions. They had like a pace car driving in front of people to break the wind. Like they cheated in every way they could except actually putting the guy on a motorbike. But still, they only made it to 2 hours and 25 seconds. They also live broadcast this worldwide. I think it was available on Facebook Live before Facebook Watch launched. But they managed to create an entire event, an entire experience, not around a sneaker, but around a human journey and an attempt to do something that no one's ever done before. They took something very, very functional, and by understanding the different path they could take a customer on, elevated it to something a little bit more meaningful. So they opened by introducing a need and using that to create awareness. Then they moved to looking at how to try something, really the consideration stage. Because when you talk about how to try, you're inherently talking about all the different things that need to be done and need to be understood. You're building a very solid case for what you're doing and why. Then they moved a little bit further and tried to create real comprehension by getting people to understand why to try something. What steps, what value comes from taking this attempt and making this big move forward. And then finally, they did their demonstration, which was, as I said, a multiple hours-long live broadcast all around the world where people could watch people running in a circle. And thousands did, because Nike's really good at getting people excited about stuff. The real difference here, from my perspective, is the difference between a focus on conversion and a focus on meaning. Conversion is very seductive. Conversion is seductive specifically because you can see results relatively quickly. You can make small tweaks and have big impact on budgets. And conversion functions in the same satisfying way a speedometer does. The harder you press, the faster it goes up. You can see how far up it goes. You can tell everyone how fast you're going. I understand the value of conversion, and I'm never going to say it's not important. But I feel like as a society, we've focused way too hard on conversion and not hard enough on meaning. Meaning isn't so much about how fast you're going, it's more about where you're going. It functions a lot more like a GPS than a map. It helps you understand where you are, where you can get to, and what surrounds you, rather than just how quickly you're moving, irregardless of where you may be headed. So, the big takeaways that I have for you are use funnels and journeys wherever possible. I know you need to make money. I know you need to optimize. Please don't do that at the exclusion of bringing meaning into what you do and bringing meaning into the experiences you create. Find a role for the brand that feels natural. I mean, the example I used, which is a sportswear example, is really easy to get away with because sportswear is quite literally always an enablement brand. You're doing something epic and heroic, and buy our products to help you is a pretty easy story to tell and easy story to believe in. But I urge you to understand your customers, understand their situations, and try to find a natural role for your brand, your product, and your experience that adds real value to the people you're speaking to. So, speedy recap. Make more meaningful stuff. It's important. The vast majority of the stuff made these days has no intrinsic meaning, which is kind of soul-crushing when you think about it. And as someone who's kind of a big booster of market economies, I think they'd function better if people actually got real meaning out of the things they bought, rather than just disposable things that last a short period of time and or frustrate you. Funnel is about your objectives. A journey is about your customer. The tension between those two things is basically what makes business interesting. If you lean too far in one direction, you go out of business. You lean too far in the other, you become sociopathic. Try to find some space in the middle. And that data is about telling you what, and insight is about finding why. The value of data can't be overstated. It's incredibly important. But understanding why you're seeing what you're seeing is always going to matter just as much as being able to tell me what you're seeing. So you optimize with what, and you create meaning with why. Thank you. I'm Jon Crowley. You can find me on these internet places to argue with me, and I have a newsletter where I talk about stuff like this all the time at attentionindustry.com.
Got time for a question or two?
Oh, of course.
Because I got questions.
I thought I'd run
Mr.
overtime and you
Jon.
had to get rid of me.
Look at this.
Oh, we have 5 minutes left.
Yeah. So now you got to stay on stage
I
with
wasn't
us.
trying to get away from everyone, I promise.
So there's one that's gotten a lot of popularity over here on Slido, and it goes like this. How do you find the line between your assumptions when looking for insights? So for example, not everyone thinks attractiveness is the most important thing. So how do you find that line between your assumptions and your own bias?
So this is actually a really important thing to consider. Generally, the best approach to this is to have a solid definition of who your target is. The more you understand which specific subset of humans you're speaking of, the more you can really see if your assumptions are tracking out. It's also helpful to try to eliminate assumptions wherever possible, learn from actual people, and then pull things, whether you like them or not, from the things they say and do, rather than just the information you walk into the situation with, rather.
Okay. So actually, it switches gears a little bit, but I know that here in Europe, obviously GDPR is huge. So what are the implications for that in terms of getting data and how you work with them?
In a weird way, this is actually a subject relatively close to my heart. Canada introduced a whole bunch of anti-spam and privacy legislation years ago when I was working specifically in digital marketing. Not specifically as strict as GDPR, I'm not going to pretend it's the same thing. But it was actually really eye-opening for me because it pushed me to engage with sources of data that, as a marketer, you don't generally consider. You can learn a ton from digging into psychology, digging into sociology, digging into academic research that tells you baseline things about humans that you can use to augment generalized understanding of your specific customers. So you don't necessarily need to be able to dive deep into a specific person, what they believe or what their actions are, to be able to find a meaningful lever to pull.
All right, cool. Oh, this one I love. So, is there data to support the opinion of senior marketing people that database decisions are actually more accurate and effective?
I find there's almost never data to support the opinions of senior marketing people.
You just have their opinions.
So what's super interesting is, I'm not sure if you caught that from the slide that was up there, but those numbers are part of eMarketer's longstanding trend of surveying senior digital marketers to ask them about what senior digital marketers do. So as a source of data, it is kind of a self-fulfilling loop, but I'm okay with that because it not only fulfilled my point with what was on it, but the fact that it's a self-fulfilling loop also kind of fulfills my point about us being kind of navel-gazing when it comes to data. So I'm really comfortable citing questionable data to make the point that data is questionable.
Yeah, okay. So here's one that I love. Ooh. Okay, given that large amounts of data reduce bias that you're exposed to, is there not a fear that by actually talking with people that you'll have more bias?
So that is an amazing question.
It is an amazing question.
And
I have some feels.
My answer to that amazing question is always that only doing one is always a recipe for disaster. The correct approach to pretty much any research problem, in my experience, is a mixture of qualitative and quantitative information. If you have a ton of data and you can remove bias from the hard numbers telling you what actions people are taking, that's amazing. But you still need to augment that with some understanding of what the context around those measurable interactions are. So ideally, you do some hands-on research with humans and some not so hands-on research with mountains of data, and then figure out how you learn more about what one means from what the other is.
Okay. So actually, along the lines of interviews, do you have tips for folks on how to interview for journey and motivation? It's a big question. I have a lot of tips. My bad answer is find me later and we can have a 4-hour conversation about this. But the biggest things that you need to consider is limiting the number of people who have input into your discussion guide or your list of questions. The thing that has caused more problems for me than anything else is needing 5 layers of approval on a list of questions or a list of subjects we're going to discuss. And so everyone's pet project gets added in, and everyone's pet feature gets added in, and everyone's individual element gets added in. And before you know it, you're spending 3 seconds discussing the why do you care about online banking products, rather than spending the entire 2-hour session talking about, the meat of how are your opinions of, I don't know, online shopping. Like, you'll learn more with less direction, but it requires a certain type of listening. If you're interviewing people to understand what they're doing, you probably want to ask them less direct questions and let them talk and vent. You'll learn more by picking apart what they say and the words they use than you will by asking them direct questions, because if there's anything I can tell you about the average person, they don't actually know why they do the stuff they do. They'll develop a theory, they'll develop a post-rationale, but most actions are happening in that subconscious system 2 part of the brain. Right. So I actually do have one more question. I think you can handle it. Because one thing you may not know about this man is this man has read probably more Batman, issues of Batman than any other person probably in this country, maybe on this continent, maybe on the planet. How many?
So of specifically like the Batman titled Batman, I've read every issue. So there was this wonderful period in time where pretty much every comic ever published was available on BitTorrent if you knew the right places to look. And so during the time I was in university, I probably read somewhere in the realm of 2,000 different Batman comics across the multiple titles. I haven't memorized all of them because I was drinking a lot. It was university. But I'm a big fan, and generally it's one of my hobbies that I still follow up with.
Yeah. So, thank you, Jon. We have a gift for you.
Thank you.
And let's give it a round of applause for Jon Crowley.